My name is Rebecca Schgallis, and I'm a Senior Education Strategist for the Camera Education Institute. I am joined here with two of my colleagues, Jany Finkielsztein, Senior Education Researcher at Camera's Education Institute, and Brandy Shufutinsky, the Director of Education and Community Engagement at the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. Camera, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, formed over 40 years ago and is devoted to promoting accurate and balanced coverage of Israel and the Middle East. The Camera Education Institute researches and exposes anti-Israel and anti-Jewish bias and factual inaccuracies in educational materials and curricula, and provides strategic support to parents and teachers to address these problems. JILV works to counter ideological anti-Semitism on the hard left that threatens classical liberalism and also exposes bias in educational materials, working with parents and teacher communities. Please put your questions in the chat. At the end of the talk, we will answer as many questions as we can. Since October 7th, anti-Semitism has risen dangerously across our country. Most notably, too many of our campuses have been taken over by so-called support for Gaza. In reality, many of these protests and encampments are actually efforts to force universities to adopt BDS measures, call for intifada and genocide against Jews, and make their campuses completely intolerable for Jewish students. While outside agitators have been involved, they have found far too many student leaders and followers willing to engage in resistance by any means necessary. These students did not become Hamas supporters overnight, but were conditioned in the language of oppression and decolonization since they were children. As many of you know too well, our K12 schools have been promoting the oppressor binary for years, even when they are not explicitly teaching anti-Israel views. This binary states that there are two groups of people, the oppressed and the oppressors. Where do Jews and Israel fit in this binary? Jews, because of our perceived success and our perceived whiteness, despite our thousands of years of persecution, are labeled as oppressors. Ignoring Jewish indigeneity, Israel is seen as a white colonial settler apartheid state. Anti-Semitic tropes applied for centuries against Jews to label us the pariahs in society are now applied to the Jewish state to make it the pariah amongst nations. Israel, according to this binary, like all racist institutions, should be destroyed. Recent polling data shows that college students overwhelmingly support the oppressor binary and as such do not believe Israel has a right to exist. In K-12 schools across the country, students engage in insightful and hateful behavior. Curriculum resources demonize Israel. Radical teacher activists use their classrooms to advance their ideological agenda. And school administrators either actively support these developments or are paralyzed as how to respond. When Congress asked us to share the worst offenders, we chose New York City Public Schools, Berkeley Public Schools, and Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland. Whether mandated by state requirements, school-driven, or promoted by radical teachers, these three districts, as well as many others in the country, share two troubling similarities. First, the oppressor binary is used in school decision-making, guiding teaching and learning, as well as student and teacher conduct. Second, the incidents in these schools are some of the most egregious, while the school district's responses are some of the weakest, leading to an environment that is hostile to Jewish students and teachers. The largest public school in the country, New York City Public Schools, also has the largest Jewish population of any American city, yet faces allegations of promoting anti-Semitic materials from top-down directives within buildings, among teachers, and from school boards. Despite New York City Public Schools' policy banning political activity in schools, enforcement is lax, evidenced by teachers wearing keffiyehs, displaying pro-Palestinian messaging, promoting anti-Israel literature, and incorporating anti-Israel narratives into classes. Jewish students and teachers have been reportedly targeted for their Jewish identity or connection to Israel, prompting pleas from the Jewish community for the chancellor to address safety concerns, which have been repeatedly minimized and ignored. Berkeley, California is notorious for being a bastion of liberalism, with decades of activism for social justice causes starting in the area. Unfortunately, Berkeley Public Schools has now become famous for tolerating Jew hatred. Teachers are openly peddling tropes, not only about the war against Hamas terrorists, but about anyone who dares criticize anti-Jewish bigotry. As reported in Berkeley Side, a Palestinian-American teacher claimed that Israel's attempt to eradicate a recognized terrorist organization is a war against the existence of Palestinians. She continued, calling parents who expressed concern for their children as being, quote, entitled. But the larger issue is the lack of response from a district administration that continues to turn a blind eye to anti-Semitism. When receiving complaints of anti-Semitism perpetrated by a teacher, administrators transferred a Jewish student to another class rather than discipline the anti-Semitic teacher. Teachers continue to use their classrooms as pulpits to spread Jew hatred and have yet to face consequences for violating civil rights of Jewish students. Montgomery County Public Schools is the largest school district in Maryland where 10% of its students are Jewish. Yet, when MCPS underwent an anti-racism audit a few years ago, and Jewish community members requested that anti-Semitism be included in those efforts, they were told no. MCPS actually promotes dismantling what they call, quote, white supremacy culture, which includes values like objectivity. We can see in real time on college campuses the danger of elevating lived experience over objective truth when teaching about the conflict. For years, MCPS has dealt with numerous swastikas and graffiti like Jews not welcome. Jewish students have received death threats. Jewish boys who wear kippot are assaulted. After October 7th, MCPS student groups organized walkouts where some students praised Hitler. Teachers made social media posts claiming Israel killed Palestinians for their organs. And Jewish teachers who spoke up were disciplined. While Jewish parents have demanded the school address anti-Semitism, the district has mostly ignored their concerns. For years, CAMERA and JILV have been researching anti-Zionist curricula organizations, their teaching resources, and their teacher training. The surge of anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism in our K-12 schools after October 7th was not a surprise to us. While too many other Jewish organizations have focused almost entirely on fighting white supremacy, we understood that this form of anti-Semitism was more insidious because it was interwoven in the oppressor binary, expressed in efforts like anti-racism, critical race theory, social justice theory, and diversity, equity, and inclusion institutionalized in our schools and universities. Sadly, too, since October 7th, many Jewish community members have realized that the Jewish communal organizations are not so organized and are still responding to October 6th concerns, not October 8th ones. It is therefore incumbent upon each and every one of us to be engaged in this fight. Tomorrow, the House Education Committee, chaired by Representative Virginia Fox, will question these three subpoena districts. We expect to hear questions about the virulent anti-Semitic incidents in their schools, the insufficient school response, as well as how each of these school districts has responded forcefully to other forms of hate, but have had a muted, both sides approach to anti-Semitism. We would like to thank the parents and teachers from Berkeley, New York City, and Montgomery County in their efforts in fighting anti-Semitism in their school districts. My colleagues and I are going to share 3 areas of concern that parents and community members should monitor. Brandy will start us off by discussing ethnic studies.
Thank you, Rebecca. Next slide, please. So as we watch university campuses erupt in anti-Semitism, it begs the question, why have students been so easily radicalized? In order to understand what's happening in colleges, we need to consider what children are learning before they get to college. Many schools of education are training future teachers and administrators in an ideology that is hostile to liberal democratic values. University students, specifically in schools of education, are being taught that decolonization and liberation ideology should be the foundation of all learning and activism. What's been happening in California and in school districts in other states provides a perfect example of what happens when decolonization and liberation ideology drives policy. Leadership in California are now requiring students to complete an ethnic studies class in order to graduate from high school. These types of policies and requirements that are being forced upon students explicitly fuel anti-Semitism. Next slide. After legislation to require ethnic studies was signed into law in California, the authors of the original highly anti-Semitic draft of the model curriculum developed their very first ethnic studies lesson. Now, many would assume that it would have focused on Black Americans and the struggle for civil rights, or Asian Americans and their experiences immigrating to the Golden State. It would be logical to think that Latino Americans would be the focus of the first lesson drafted, or Native Americans given their rich history in California. So imagine everyone's surprise when the very first lesson published on the Liberated Ethnic Studies website was Teach Palestine. Now, there are those out there that'll say that this critique is being anti-Arab, or it's some sort of call to erase Arab Americans from history. This couldn't be further from the truth. What was shocking was the very real erasure of Black, Latino, Asian, and Native Americans from the Liberated Ethnic Studies first lesson. I mean, so many people supported the ethnic studies requirement because they acknowledged that the histories, experiences, and contributions of those communities had been excluded for too many years. What we were seeing was history repeating itself. Black, Latino, Asian, and Native Americans were once again being swept aside, replaced with lessons that were about ideology and global politics rather than people and communities. Anyone with the most basic knowledge of history could see immediately that the Teach Palestine curriculum was based on historical revisions, lies, and anti-Semitic ideas. In fact, I argue that the Teach Palestine curriculum does exactly what critics of current social studies classes do. It erases the histories of minoritized communities, replacing those narratives with the narrative of another. Next slide. Teach Palestine, along with every individual and organization who promotes them, makes their position clear. They don't believe that Jews should have the same rights to be represented in curriculum and the same experiences and histories and narratives shared. Next slide. Trying to head off pushback on their ideologically biased position, liberated ethnic studies activists are not limiting their recruitment to college students and future teachers. They are actively targeting high school children to become part of their movement. At the end of 2023, the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies recruited their first cohort of high school students to participate in 8 weeks of liberated ethnic studies indoctrination. Upon completion of the 8-week program, participants were awarded $500. Next slide. Ethnic studies activists have seized on this moment with dozens of organizations forming to provide teacher training and professional development and to develop curricula, including JILV, which has a history of spreading anti-Semitic ideology. These organizations have a very clear mission, equating things like capitalism, belief in God, and property ownership with white supremacy. And as these beliefs become normalized in classrooms, activists are developing students into an ideological army ready to take orders. After the October 7th Hamas terrorist attacks, students were activated by activist teachers and community activists to stage walkout protests in support of Hamas. Because these students had been fed a diet of radicalism, they were able to justify the slaughter of hundreds of Jewish and non-Jewish Israelis as legitimate forms of resistance. There's a coordinated effort by liberated ethnic studies activists to hijack the experiences of marginalized groups by falsely equating them to the experiences of Palestinians and other Arabs. This is just one example used in a teacher professional development training that instructs educators to use the tragedy of the Trail of Tears experienced by Native Americans and liken it to the experience of Arabs in the British Mandate. All of this has been supported by making an already radical university discipline a requirement for high school students who want to earn their diploma. Next slide. The day after Hamas raped, kidnapped, and slaughtered their way into Israel, this was posted on the social media accounts of one of the main groups working to institutionalize anti-Semitism, Liberated Ethnic Studies. This was a call to action. not in response to an Israeli military response to the Hamas terrorist attack, but it was a call to action in support of what Hamas terrorists and other Gazans did. So when we look at what's happening on college campuses all over the country, we shouldn't be surprised that students who have been exposed to an ideology that justifies anything, as long as it's done by those labeled as oppressed. Next slide. Now, many assume that their children won't be exposed to this type of Jew hatred because maybe their state doesn't have an ethnic studies requirement. Unfortunately, this is not true. New York is seeing an unprecedented number of anti-Semitic incidents in the K12 school system, partially because radicalized teachers and administrators are leading the Jew-hating charge. Partnering with an organization, Teaching While Muslim, which has a goal of creating and disseminating learning materials centered on Muslim identity, New York City Educators for Palestine held a workshop where leaders ignored the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas and redefined anti-Semitism. Next slide. When groups like New York City Educators for Palestine and Teaching While Muslim gain access to our children, they create toolkits to indoctrinate students to walk out of school during school hours to participate in re-education teach-ins. These events occur during the day when so many parents assume that their kids are safe at school, learning, and socializing with their friends. Next slide. Now, before I hand it over to Jany, I just want to reiterate, anti-Semitism in K-12 impacts us all. Living in a red state or a conservative district will not necessarily safeguard your children from experiencing the types of bigotry that we're talking about this evening. The Ethnic Studies Network of Texas works with the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies, the same group that pushes anti-Semitic materials into classrooms all over the United States. And they're actively pressuring Texas policymakers to follow California's lead and mandate ethnic studies in K-12 schools. Jany.
Thank you, Brandy. Next slide, please. Anti-Israel activist organizations have multiple strategies to reach educators and infiltrate schools. After October 7, their efforts have intensified, as my colleagues have shared. And as Brandy shared, many are part of a network, an interconnected web of organizations and activists focused on pushing anti-Israel ideology into K-12 classrooms and instigating anti-Semitic sentiment among the youth in America. Another example of this sort of organization is the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, or AROC. AROC is one of the most active anti-Israel groups protesting Israel's military response to the Hamas attacks on October 7. Even before Israel had responded to the attack on October 7, while Jews were still being slaughtered, AROC released a statement that it holds, quote, the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all unfolding violence we've witnessed across historic Palestine. AROC claimed that the Hamas terrorist attack was the result of colonial aggression, blaming Israel for the massacre committed against its innocent civilians. AROC recommitted its efforts to support boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, against Israel, and called Israel an apartheid state. After October 7, AROC escalated its efforts to defund Israel. It has been a main driver for the Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies movement. Next slide, please. AROC's purpose is to inject Palestine into every aspect of K-12 education. It presented an online workshop as part of the Democratic Socialists of America's Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions and Palestine Solidarity Group series. The presentation was filled with emotion-evoking, but empty of any factual content. It equated Israel and the United States as colonizing enterprises, claiming, quote, Israel used the U.S. playbook to colonize Palestine, learning from what the United States did to the indigenous people in this land in order to implement their strategy in Palestine. The workshop denied the historical Jewish connection to the land of Israel, instead fabricating a false narrative of an indigenous Palestinian Arab history. Maps presented during the workshop featured Palestine with Israel in parentheses, suggesting Palestine as the permanent name for the land. However, the name Palestine was imposed by the Romans after suppressing the Jewish revolt, derived from the extinct Philistines who were Greek, not Arab. Arab conquest occurred centuries later, with Arabs not constituting the majority until recently due to the depopulation under Turkish rule. This concealed history is distorted by Palestinian advocates. AROC's workshops and presentations for teachers are filled with anti-Israel propaganda designed to teach receptive and uninformed educators and, in the end, their students to demonize the state of Israel. It presents Zionism, the Jewish people's right to national self-determination in their historic homeland, as a racist movement. But AROC conceals the genocidal racism of Palestinian groups like Hamas. People should be reading the Hamas charter to see the genocidal intent. Next slide, please. AROC's executive director, Lara Kiswani, announced that she's a member of Berkeley Unified School District's Ethnic Studies Advisory Committee during a school board meeting. She's a veteran BDS activist who has been relentless in her political agenda march to inject anti-Israel anti-Semitic material into K-12 schools. Berkeley High School students participating in walkouts received flyers from AROC, and AROC promoted a national protest in October for high schoolers to walk out in support of Palestine and to escalate the effort. In addition, AROC leads youth programs within the Berkeley schools, claiming to help Arab youth development, leadership, advocacy, campaign development skills, and also inviting staffs to join their programs. Next slide, please. Another organization promoting an anti-Israel agenda is Rethinking Schools. Rethinking Schools calls itself the country's leading grassroots magazine for social and racial justice in education. Its materials and teacher workshops, however, promote a false image of Israel and its history. In October 12, just 5 days after the Hamas massacre, Rethinking Schools affirmed their support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions BDS movement. Rethinking Schools co-sponsored an event for educators framed by, quote, collective liberation and justice to redefine anti-Semitism in their own terms. It co-sponsored the event with known anti-Israel organizations, including a New York City collective of radical educators. The panel also, including a New York City public school principal, who praised the pro-Hamas protesters and gave appreciation for the curricular materials from Parseo. The curricular material from Parseo presents the vilification of Israel and Zionism as totally distinct and separate from anti-Semitism. Rethinking Schools is offering a propagandistic educator workshop later this month. Included in their panel are a coordinator from Teach Palestine that Brandy mentioned and co-founder of BLM at School organization. Next slide, please. While organizations like the ones Brandy and I presented offer workshops directly to teachers, school districts can also offer problematic professional development for them. For example, Montgomery County Public Schools offered compensated staff training to prevent Islamophobia, but no such training appears to be available for anti-Semitism. The workshop facilitator, Susan Douglas, has extensive involvement in organizations promoting curricular materials that seek to eliminate Israel. Douglas is an associate of Dar Alam Teachers Institute. Dar Alam posts articles defending Palestinian narratives while excoriating democracies, including America and Israel. Douglas is a former teacher at the Islamic Saudi Academy of Virginia, a Saudi government-supported school, and she consults on textbooks and curriculum by major publishers. And lastly, she's also a curriculum specialist for the Council on Islamic Education. The Council on Islamic Education has been described as a significant gatekeeper of content, wielding considerable influence over publishers. This influence is believed to go largely unchecked, leading to history textbooks conforming to the demands of Islamists. The American Textbook Council, in its report, presented that the Council on Islamic Education advocates a specific political agenda and actively promotes an interpretation of history aligned with only Islamic perspectives. The Council recently changed its name to Institute of Religion and Civic Values. Changing the name by these types of organizations is a tactic to cover their tracks. Next slides, please. Teacher unions have been an additional vector for anti-Israel activism. From our research and published accounts, teacher unions have promoted anti-Israel activism, curricular resources, and training for teachers before October 7. But since October 7, they have intensified their efforts sponsoring and promoting pro-Hamas high school walkouts, materials in schools, and engage in efforts to publicly denounce the Jewish state. The Berkeley Unified School Districts Union, the Berkeley Federation of Teachers, passed a resolution in December for a ceasefire denying the right of Israel to defend itself in response to the Hamas terrorist attack. The past resolution was written by an ethnic studies teacher in the district, and it left the Jewish teachers isolated. In addition, the union wrote a defamatory petition accusing Jewish parents of being anti-Palestinian racist and presented it to the school board. They implied that Jewish parents were making up anti-Semitic incidents, and by making quote-unquote false complaints, it hurt the Palestinians, but these Jewish parents had every right to speak up. The Montgomery County Teachers Union had a member propose a ceasefire resolution. The motion failed for procedural reasons. Next slide, please. In New York City, the movement of rank-and-file educators caucus of the United Federation of Teachers published a statement against the chancellor's support of Israel after the October 7 Hamas massacre. This teacher union group claimed that the chancellor's statement was solely focused on the need of Israeli families. The union's caucus included resources to teachers from Teach Palestine and Rethinking Schools. Both organizations support anti-Israel causes, as you've heard here today. The union caucus announced that it was planning to co-sponsor high school protests across the city. In a Facebook group for New York City educators, UFT members, teachers denied that the posters shown above, reading, "Please keep the world clean," showing the blue Star of David in a garbage can, was anti-Semitic. And this sign was used during an October high school walkout in New York City, created with school materials. Next slide, please. More recently, the Massachusetts Teacher Association approved the ceasefire resolution, labeling Israel's defensive war against Hamas a genocidal war on the Palestinian people. The MTA also approved a resolution to develop a framework and curricular materials for learning about Israel in what it calls, quote, occupied Palestine, to be used by teachers in classrooms. Next slide. The MTA hosted a 2-hour webinar called Context and Connection, Palestinian Struggle Against Anti-Palestinian Racism, The webinar framed anti-Palestinian racism through a panel of radical speakers presenting a one-sided view, labeling the Jewish self-determination effort and Israeli defense as racism, while barely acknowledging significant events like the Hamas attack. It emphasized that Israel and the US, as settler colonial states, advocated against equating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism and portrayed Palestinians solely as victims, disregarding historical context, fabricating claims the speakers vilified and delegitimized Israel. At the MTA convention at the end of April, a flyer and resources from the latest publication of Rethinking Schools were distributed. The materials propagate narratives that demonize Israel while portraying Palestinians solely as victims of oppression. People in other states need to be on the lookout about their unions and their potential political activities against Israel and proactively lobby to stop it. Now, Rebecca will present about curricular materials and content. Thank you.
Thank you, Jany. As Brandy and Jany have explained, curricula using the simplistic oppressed-oppressor binary to explain the Israeli-Arab conflict have infiltrated our schools. Curriculum organizations promoting this binary are based on what some call a red-green alliance. Red refers to Marxist ideology and green refers to Islamist ideology.
Next slide, please. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. The Zinn Education Project, named after Howard Zinn. Zinn is an anarchist and socialist who wrote A People's History of the United States, which has been widely used in American classrooms for decades. After October 7th, the Zinn Education Project curated a set of resources on the Arab-Israeli conflict. They state, students need to study how the current crisis is shaped in large part by the settler colonial history and conditions of apartheid. Next slide, please. Zinn just released a new lesson plan called Teaching the Seeds of Violence in Palestine, Israel. In the lesson, students represent various historical figures, but the author admits that the Palestinian figures are completely made up. The author reports that at the end of the lesson, his students shared that they, quote, recognized that what began as the Palestinians' land ended with appropriation and domination. The Zinn Education Project is one of dozens of anti-Semitic organizations followed by thousands of teachers who use their resources in classrooms around the country. Next slide, please. But this curriculum is not just anti-Semitic. In Marxist Orwellian fashion, these activist curricular organizations invert and pervert the truth. For example, in Teaching While Muslim, a resource describes the Intifada as, quote, coordinated strikes, boycotts, and other sophisticated revolts in a persistent effort to win a Palestinian self-rule. Suicide bombings are now sophisticated revolts. Next slide, please. Children's literature, meant to evoke an emotional, sympathetic response, is widely used as the conduit for introducing an anti-Israel narrative in the classroom. For example, Berkeley Schools has actively promoted teaching materials in their ethnic studies newsletters and Arab American Heritage Month. In the newsletter, the book Determined to Stay, Palestinian Youth Fight for Their Village by Jody Sokolor is offered for free. Jody Sokolor is a coordinator of the Teach Palestine project. She is also the co-founder of the National Coalition of Liberated Ethnic Studies, which Brandy spoke about, and managing editor of Rethinking Schools, which Jany spoke about, which just published an entire magazine called Teach Palestine. The book is prominently featured on the website of Teach Palestine, where it is offered as a free curricular resource to teachers. She presents her book as an example of, quote, anti-racist education grounded in an ethnic studies framework, but in reality, it is an anti-Israel propaganda designed to teach naive, ill-informed students to demonize and hate Israel. In the book, the author announces that she is a white Jewish high school social studies teacher. Herein lies one of the most painful pieces of everything we are experiencing since October 7th. Jews who are actively participating and often leading the charge that Israel is an apartheid state. These, quote, as a Jew Jews who start their anti-Israel statements with as a Jew, use their Jewish identity to give credibility to the false claim that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Sadly, many of these so-called curricular organizations are led by as a Jew Jews. Next slide, please. May is Jewish American Heritage Month, where many school districts are promoting recommended books. New York City Schools recommends a lengthy list, but as the Elders of Zion blog points out, nearly half of Jews live in Israel, but none of the books on the New York City list address this reality. Yet, in the general library collection and for Arab American Heritage Month, many schools have promoted books from the Palestinian perspective that either portray Israelis as oppressors or erase Jews altogether from Israel. Next slide, please. By now, many realize that this anti-Israel narrative did not begin on October 7th. Many school districts, including the subpoena districts, have been promoting anti-racism, demanding that teachers and students take a stand or a knee against supposed systemic racism. The language of anti-racism, colonial settler, apartheid, decolonization, abolitionist, and liberation have been present in schools for years. In 2021, 3 years before people were really paying attention, Fairfax County Schools in Virginia had incorporated videos into literacy lessons from Woke Kindergarten. Woke Kindergarten describes itself as a, quote, global abolitionist early childhood ecosystem and visionary creative portal. Parents investigated Woke Kindergarten and found multiple social media posts calling for the destruction of Israel. 3 years later, a whistleblower at an Oakland, California school shared with the media that his school had spent $250,000 on Woke Kindergarten despite falling test scores. And in New York City, teachers used one of Woke Kindergarten's rewriting of the wheels on the bus to the wheels on the tank, turning the song into a Palestinian resistance poem. Woke Kindergarten is an example of intersectionality, a framework for understanding how overlapping identities are affected by power and how groups that are considered oppressed can join forces together in their resistance against so-called oppression. Next slide, please. Another example of intersectionality is with BLM at schools. BLM at Schools published a statement on October 17th, 2023, accusing Israel of, quote, settler colonialism, land dispossession, occupation, blockade, apartheid, and attempted genocide of millions of Palestinians. The organization also stated that curricula taught to students must include Palestinian existence, resistance, culture, global contributions, and the ongoing struggle to realize a free Palestine. Both Berkeley and New York City schools recommended BLM at School resources to their teachers. Those promoting the anti-Israel and anti-Semitic narrative have aligned themselves with other social justice and anti-racism movements, thus laying the groundwork for schools to become hotbeds of anti-Semitism. Next slide, please. These curricular organizations, along with many schools, have also been on a mission to elevate Arab and Muslim culture, normalize Palestine, all while minimizing and erasing Jewish history and Israel. At an MCPS school, where a world history teacher and DEI leader made a social media post claiming Israel kills Palestinians for their organs, and where there have been multiple graffiti incidents, the school has almost ignored anti-Semitism and the Jewish community. The school has promoted homeroom lessons on several forms of hate, including racism and bigotry against people with special needs, immigrants, and Islamophobia, but anti-Semitism was not included. For Arab American Heritage Month, the school sent a community newsletter announcing all the ways the school would celebrate Arab culture. The library held events and activities. The science department held a lesson on the remarkable achievements of Arabs in science, education, music, medicine, journalism, business, and sports. The world languages department held a lesson comparing Arabic to Spanish. History classes learned about Arab contributions to the Renaissance, and even the PE department developed additional activities. The school also hosted an iftar dinner. A Muslim student association in another school held an event called Hijab Nova, where they provided hijabs to students and teachers to wear for the day. For Jewish American Heritage Month happening right now, the school's library made a book display, put out some word searches and coloring pages, and had an activity about the dreidel. So what do we do? Brandy is going to share some steps parents should take.
So working together with organizations like Camera, like Peer K12, we've come up with a couple of different tools that parents and community members can use together in their school districts. And this is one of them. After the webinar, we're going to send this out along with some other resources to everyone who registered. One of the first things to consider is encouraging your school district to adopt and enforce the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. Now, there are many people that are opposed to this for multiple reasons. One of the most common being that there's concern that the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism will prevent the right for parents to be, or anyone to be, critical of policies of the state of Israel. That is not true. What IRA does is it gives a framework for understanding what is and what isn't anti-Semitism. And obviously, looking at the state of our schools and learning right now, that's very needed. We encourage everyone to please explore the resources at the Camera Educational Institute, and there are many. They are wonderful, rich resources. To recognize and celebrate Jewish American Heritage Month, and as Rebecca pointed out, we see little attempts to maybe with coloring pages and I guess, what did you say, the history of the dreidel? No, we mean something that's actually active, where Jewish community members are involved with bringing together resources and events for schools and districts to celebrate Jewish American heritage. The National Education Association's Jewish Affairs Caucus developed this screening tool, and again, you'll get this after the webinar, where it helps determine whether materials, practices, or communications are anti-Semitic. If we use this tool for any and all of the materials that we spoke about today, and the many more that we're aware of that are being taught in schools today, we would find an overwhelming majority of them would be deemed anti-Semitic. And then implement JILV's best practices for combating anti-Semitism in K12 school districts. Again, you'll get that after the webinar. Rebecca.
Next slide, please. In addition to the resources that Brandy just shared from JILV and others, I want to highlight some resources on the Camera Education website that will assist parents on the ground. First, CAMERA produces extensive research reports on curricula. Our latest is on Brown University's Choices program. We also have a chart explaining all of the curricula resources we discussed tonight and many more, with explanations as to why they are so problematic. We have curated a list of recommended children's and young adult books on Israel, as well as a list of highly problematic books. Lastly, CAMERA is finalizing a curriculum on the history of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. If you haven't already, please put your questions in the Q&A. Jany, what's our first question?
Hi, thank you everybody for all your incredible questions. We hope that we can address many of these interesting ideas that you really want us to discuss. So the first question is, what can communities do to combat infiltration of anti-Israel teaching in the local schools?
I'll start.
Go ahead.
So one of the most important things is to actually be aware of what's happening in your schools regarding policies and regarding curricular materials. And we're seeing that start to happen, thank goodness. A lot of parents have become very involved in their children's education. We need that and more. In coordinated efforts is always more helpful rather than doing it kind of as a lone wolf. So when you're aware of what curricular materials are in your kid's school, say you submit a public records request to get access to that material, and then the question may come up, okay, now what do we do with it? How do I know if it's anti-Semitic? That's when you contact one of us. You can contact CAMERA, you can contact JILV. This is what we do. We go through materials, we make suggestions, we, highlight problem areas, and then we use that information to hopefully help parents and community members work with their district to do better for our kids.
In addition to the steps that Brandy recommended, I would also add that it's enormously important for parents to realize that your school board and your school board elections are, is very, very important in terms of stopping the funding of these organizations. If the district is bringing them in for teacher training, contracting them for resources and whatnot. And in general, your school district sets the budget. And so, throughout this talk tonight, we have emphasized certain themes that have really overtaken the schools, the oppressor binary, the focus on, colonial settler and decolonization, even when they're not talking about Israel. Those are choices that school districts make, and those choices are usually represented in how they spend their money. So if you have school board elections coming up, it's really important to support candidates who not only want to fight anti-Semitism and make sure that they want to fight all forms of anti-Semitism, not just when it manifests as white supremacy, but also candidates who are interested in academic merit versus this lived experience and, promoting identity politics in the school classroom.
Hey, thank you, Brandy and Rebecca. The next question is, what cities has this coalition, the Liberated Ethnic Studies Coalition, what cities has it impacted or areas in the country?
All regions of the country. So they're operating in multiple states in different ways. And they design themselves a coalition because they're coming into schools in different ways. In certain places like California, where there's an ethnic studies requirement, or in Minnesota, where there's a newly adopted ethnic studies requirement, they're coming in by providing teacher training and professional development on ethnic studies and curricular development. In other places like parts of Massachusetts, like Texas, like Florida, they're coming in through DEI, culturally responsive education programs. So multiple districts all across the country, their entire goal and mission is to make this to make this a national effort, and that's what they're doing.
Thank you. The next question is, why can law enforcement go after these organizations?
Well, we have, free speech laws, and this is not necessarily a crime, even if it's insidious and despicable. This isn't necessarily a law enforcement issue, unless of course, there was, some crime being committed here. However, this is where there are other laws, though, that may apply in terms of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. There may be additional laws and educational statutes that vary state to state. Obviously, there may even be regulations that the school has that are not being carried out. And so it's really important for parents and community members to familiarize themselves with their school district's policies, their state's policies. In some states, it's possible to file civil rights complaints in an educational setting in addition to Title VI. So there's a lot of different avenues that parents and community members can take legally. But I also want to emphasize that that's just one route. The legal avenue is one way. There's the political avenue. There's the public relations avenue. And then there's the, push that parents just need to be in the schools, meeting with their administrators and teachers and explaining to them what their concerns are, helping them provide accurate resources, and essentially hold them accountable for what and how they're teaching students.
Thank you. There's a question asking about what the MTA, how the community has responded, the community of teachers, to push back against the MTA efforts in Massachusetts. If it's okay, I'll answer that one. So the Massachusetts community, the Jewish community has really organized the teacher community and also the parent community, and they have really pushed back with rallies and different efforts and informing the press about what is happening with the MTA. They have also had meetings with these officials in the MTA and professors pushing the ideology. But in addition, there was actually a position that was passed at the last MTA convention in where the MTA has to have now a policy in place to get involved with international political issues. Also, they have to come up with a way to have it part of the policy to promote what they want to promote. They can just do it without guidelines. So those guidelines will be yet to be determined, but they are now going to be required to have those guidelines. That was called NBI number 6. There were other motions in place that couldn't be actually voted because there was no quorum of the convention. But the efforts continue with speaking at the board meeting for the MTA and also participating in the webinars. There's also an effort to host and organize a webinar on anti-Semitism for all the teachers that are members of the Massachusetts Teacher Union. There's another question. What is the most successful place to target? Is it the school boards, the school administrators? Is it organizing the parents? What would be your first line of effort?
All of it. There isn't one thing that parents can do. This is a multifaceted effort in order to tackle this. Just going the legal route, for example, is not going to be enough pressure, unfortunately, to right this ship. And so, in some ways, unfortunately, we're playing a lot of whack-a-mole around the country, and that is very frustrating, not only to us, in the work that we do, but obviously for the parents on the ground. They feel like they can't get ahead of the problem. So, one of the things I would suggest is use the summer to regroup. The incidents should decline over the summer. Your kids will be home. And so to think about strategically what it is you want to do in the coming year. I think it's really important and incumbent upon everybody that this is an all hands on deck situation and that we cannot rely even on camera and JILV to do all the work. We don't have enough people. We need the parents on the ground. We're here to support and provide the resources, but organizing is important. You need numbers. Reaching out to legal organizations that might be able to support you if that's needed. Reaching out to media organizations, reaching out to Camera JILV because we have the research on all these organizations and can help guide your conversations with the district administrators and school boards.
Okay, the next question is there an assembly topic speaker programming that can be brought to high schools to normalize the Jewish presence, to reinforce normalcy for being Israeli, Zionist, and for just promoting the culture?
Yes, there are a lot of resources and organizations to do just that. What has to happen in most districts is there has to be a teacher, a student, a group of parents that kind of sort of petitions the school to do that. And then just saying, okay, well, we need to have more lessons on anti-Semitism, or we need to have a speaker come in to talk about anti-Semitism. A one-off program is not what seems to work the best. Many of these school districts have used, say, the ADL's No Place for Hate program. Many of them are part of it. Those school districts are hotbeds of anti-Semitism, which indicates maybe that program isn't quite working. It's not getting whatever point across that anti-Semitism is something that we should all stand against. Instead, it's a one-off program that a school or a district can say, hey, we did it. We brought in a speaker to talk about anti-Semitism. So we kind of checked that box. There needs to be something more robust. And what I say is we look at what the opposite side has done. They're not doing one-off bringing in a speaker to speak about Islamophobia. They're instituting programming. They're making their narrative part of the curriculum, from teacher training to the curriculum that kids see. The worksheets, the materials, Rethinking Schools, Zen Education Project. Look at your school and see how many of them use the Zen People's History book. How many of their curricula reference Rethinking Schools? And what we need to do is that become part of the school culture, and to show up.
There are several questions about funding for these organizations. Where is the funding coming from? I don't know who would like to start.
Do you want to start, Brandy?
I'll let you start.
Perhaps Brandy has more to add to this. It's a bit complicated. I think that in part because of the encampments and the protests that we're seeing across the country, there's finally an interest and a motivation to look into who's actually funding the organizations that are, obviously supporting these encampments and protesters and agitators across the country. We know, because of the cross-networking of so many of the people and organizations that we spoke about just now, you'll notice that if you try to draw a web of how these groups are connected, it would be very confusing because there's so much overlap and so many of the same people in the same organizations. We know that they're getting funding from somewhere, but we don't have all the answers yet. It's kind of the next layer of research.
I just want to add, when we think about who's funding these, we are, in part. California dedicated $55 million to their ethnic studies curriculum. When liberated ethnic studies organizations come into districts to provide teacher training, that's taxpayer dollars that's paying them. The $250,000 that was spent on woke kindergarten at Hayward Unified was federal funds that was given to that district from COVID relief money. So yes, there are nefarious actors, and I'm thankful that there's finally a spotlight on identifying those nefarious actors that are funding these highly anti-Semitic, Jew-hating materials and programs in schools. And we need an equally robust investigation on how much of our tax dollars is going to paying for these organizations and programs.
There's also organizations that fund with grants, like the Tides Foundation and the Sparkplug Foundation and other foundations that intentionally want to support this, or organizations that unintentionally don't even know about what these organizations are doing. So they're very good about kind of creating a hoax and pretending that they're really youth programming, that they're coming in to the schools to really help students, or for culturally responsive teaching or social justice. And so they are very clever at applying for these grants and getting funding from organizations. The next questions, there are several questions about tomorrow. What should people expect that's going to happen tomorrow at the hearing? Who's going to be talking? What will they see in the hearing?
So if you've tuned into any of the college presidents' hearings, we can expect that it will be similar to that. We have the chancellor from New York City, the superintendent from Berkeley Schools, and the president of the school board for Montgomery County Schools. And the reason the president of the school board was chosen is because the superintendent at Montgomery County Schools that was in that position up until just a couple months ago stepped down because of other controversial issues in Montgomery County Schools. And so the House Education Committee was looking for the next most, powerful person in the school district. What we will expect to see is just on a logistical level, the members of the committee will take turns going back and forth between the parties to ask questions. And each committee member has 5 minutes to ask their question, and then there is time within that for the subpoenaed individuals to respond. We know from our preparation with the congressional staffers on this issue, in providing research on these schools, a lot of this research is publicly available. The media has covered a lot of this, and a lot of these incidents were covered extensively on social media. We know that they'll most likely bring up certain incidents, teachers who have abused their position in indoctrinating students, and how the schools have or have not held them accountable. We also expect that they may talk about student behavior and ask similar questions. So we expect them to maybe focus in on disparities between how anti-Semitism is handled versus how other forms of hate bias are handled in their school districts.
Anything else? Okay. The next question is, what advice would you give for a staff that has to walk along the fence between teacher union, their board of education, their supervisor with regards to reporting personnel for disseminating propaganda against Israel or public hate speech?
I'm a former teacher, so I'm very sympathetic to this problem of having to navigate your administrator, your union, your fellow colleagues that you might be in disagreement with. I don't have any sage advice here, unfortunately. I think this is a really fraught issue, but what we have seen is that when Jewish teachers can find allies in the building, Jewish teachers, but also other teachers. We forget sometimes that there are plenty of other decent Americans out there that are also appalled by what is happening in our country and in our schools. And so we need to think beyond just the Jewish teachers in our building, because you may, as I have often been in my teaching career, the only Jewish teacher in the building. So find the other allies. If the union is not supportive, then you may need to seek support, legal support, if necessary, given the incident, with an organization. There's plenty of pro bono Jewish legal organizations that are happy to help and support teachers. We also have so many examples across the country of teachers and parents uniting together and supporting each other in their work. And so that work has been really critical. And sometimes the parents are the ones that offer the best support to the teachers, because the teachers can feed them information, but stay protected. And meanwhile, the parents can kind of lead on that fight. And so the teacher can stay anonymous, but provide crucial information to the parents on the ground.
There's a question about the outcome from the congressional hearing. What do we hope, having researched for years about what's going on in K-12, is going to happen as an outcome, but what could also be more possible steps that could happen after the congressional hearing?
So, I mean, I think one of the things that we hope happen is that the spotlight on what's actually occurring in our schools regarding anti-Semitism gets bigger, so that it raises awareness about what's happening, but also that these people who are in these leadership positions in districts are held accountable for their inaction and hopefully given directives on what steps they need to take. My hope is that this is just the beginning. There are plenty of school districts that are having similar, if not worse, problems with anti-Semitism that also maybe deserve to be called before the committee.
And I think in addition to what Brandy offered, I think there's, in addition to the schools, there's we hope that the committee will also take up some other kind of ancillary issues related to education that we know are impacting how anti-Semitism is being addressed in terms of Title VI. There's other issues that the committee is potentially considering.
There's also several questions about teachers' freedom of speech or wearing keffiyehs in schools, what constitutes, whether that is legal or appropriate, or whether it should have consequences because of code of conduct.
So, this is obviously one of the it shouldn't be a sticky issue, but it is a sticky issue, as to where does free speech end, versus, the rights of those that are being harassed and targeted. We've seen obviously on the college campuses that all of a sudden these, university presidents who have backed all kinds of restrictions on speech when it comes to, misgendering students, about racism, about what students can wear for costumes on Halloween, are now the champions of free speech when it comes to students calling for the genocide of Jews. And so that double standard is, obviously what is so, kind of despicable in all of this. We see that same challenge in K-12 schools, unfortunately. So, every school district should have state professional standards for teachers when it comes to either how they dress in terms of political messaging, in terms of what they can use as their email signature, what they can hang in their classroom, even social media postings and things like that, most likely these teachers have to sign documents. I certainly did at the beginning of each school year. Obviously, a lot of teachers are abusing that, or what is considered political speech is being redefined in this conflict. And part of the reason it is being redefined is that for several years now, schools have allowed teachers to make statements supporting BLM, LGBTQ, and all other kinds of social justice issues. And now we're at the latest iteration of another social justice issue. And it's, of course, even more contentious if that's possible. So I would suggest to parents and other community members that they need to get their schools to enforce the standards of conduct that the schools probably already have, that they're not enforcing. And the other thing that I would also add to that is we all know that if a teacher came in wearing a Confederate flag, sweatshirt, or dressed as the KKK, that would not be allowed. The teacher would be immediately put on administrative leave and under investigation. And so we need to have the same level of standard when it comes to intimidating and harassing Jewish students in schools.
There is a question about if there is any brief history that we can give of when this binary and pro-Palestinian movement within teaching in public schools began. How did it grow? How is it that it developed to what it has become now?
It's been growing for a number of decades. So what's happened more recently in more recent years is there are multiple different vehicles for anti-Semitism to come into K-12 education. The ideology has been growing in academia for years and years. It's now trickled down where it's now in this loop between K-12 education and academia. So a discipline like ethnic studies, that came in the 60s in the university. The decision then to let that discipline become a mandatory class that everybody needs to take in an entire state or an entire district in order to graduate is where we see it coming in. And so what you have is radicalized academics who have been in this discipline for a number of years or for a number of decades, then bringing that ideology into K-12 through teacher professional development or through curriculum development. It's similar to where if you look back at some of the social emotional learning SEL programs first started, they were to address learning differences. I mean, that's how they were structured. It quickly devolved into something else that is just as rooted in the oppression binary as ethnic studies is.
And I want to add to that too, that, this language has its roots in Soviet Marxist, Cold War era, history here. And so, just the way that anti-Zionism was targeted against Israel is a fallout from the Cold War. And then the rise of critical theory, which is rooted in Marxism, began really in Berkeley during the 1960s, and was kind of an offshoot of the social justice movements that were part of, civil rights and women's rights and everything in the 1960s, but then took a very hard left turn. And I think we have time for one more question, Jany.
No, I just want to add that the role of the teacher in the classroom also shifted from focusing on, you know, factual knowledge for informed debate, the teachers and the schools of education that train them really began to see them as social justice activists. And so they see themselves as that, having that role in the classroom, which really takes away from factual knowledge development. Yeah, one of the questions, there are several questions about curriculum to combat this. And one of the questions is, you know, what about Holocaust education and programs? Are there any materials from Holocaust education or any other materials that could be suggested to bring into schools?
Right. So I think that one thing that is important to note is Holocaust education is an important thing that students should learn about. They should learn about the Holocaust. They should learn about World War II. That's part of American history. It's part of world history. It's part of Jewish history. It should be a basic, like part of what would be baseline, what any kid should learn as part of their social studies and history curriculum. That is not the remedy to addressing anti-Semitism. So unfortunately, we are hearing a lot of, calls for more Holocaust education as anti-Semitism grows in K-12 education. That hasn't been a remedy, because teaching about the Holocaust doesn't relate to the type of anti-Semitism we're seeing today. Contemporary anti-Semitism, for the most part, how it plays out in K-12, and I'd argue university settings, isn't following Nazi anti-Semitism. It's following the Red-Green Alliance. It's neo-Marxist and it's Islamist. Holocaust education doesn't address those roots. So aside from obviously providing Holocaust education for kids, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, if there's curriculum actually addressing contemporary anti-Semitism, it's going to focus on the ideological roots of contemporary anti-Semitism, which are neo-Marxism and Islamist ideology. And curriculum related to things like ethnic studies, liberated ethnic studies has had a head start, so they're spreading. There are organizations, we're developing a different form of ethnic studies that isn't rooted in the oppression binary, that is what most people think of when they think about ethnic studies, which is more diverse history and social studies of multiple groups that make up the fabric of our country. And so if anyone wants information on that, I'm sure that'll be part of the materials that we send out after this webinar.
I also want to add to that, because there is this knee-jerk reaction that when there's an anti-Semitic incident, Jewish organizations will send out a Holocaust survivor. They'll call for more Holocaust education. And as Brandy explained, it's not the type of anti-Semitism that we're experiencing today. But I also want to add to that, I think, the underlying assumption with Holocaust education is that if students somehow learn about how horrible the genocide against the Jews was, they will become more empathetic and, inclined to not be anti-Semitic. And unfortunately, October 7th should have, dissuaded us from that assumption. The worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust led to celebrations of more and calls for more murder of Jews. And so we're not going to build empathy by, showing Jews at one of our lowest points in history. And I also want to add too that one of the issues with Holocaust education, when it's used as a tool to fight anti-Semitism, not as part of the history curriculum, is that we tend to see an increase in anti-Semitic incidents immediately afterwards in the schools that I work with closely, because students are not educated on the larger context of anti-Semitism, and it just kind of turns into a silly lesson. As Brandy mentioned, you can't just go in and do a one-off. As a former teacher, if you want students to learn, you have to be doing programming that is much more intensive than that. So we would like to thank all of you for attending tonight. Please tune in to tomorrow's hearing. You can stream it live from the House Education Committee's YouTube site. And we want to thank all of you for your continued efforts to fight anti-Semitism. JILV and camera are here to support your efforts. Thank you and good night.